They said to him, and you read them, will you, for me, verse 7, 8, and 9, please.
They said to him, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? He said to them, for your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for unchastity, and marries another, commits adultery.
And friends, this same truth will be true today. We may, out of consideration for human weaknesses and human failures, we may make our divorce regulations, our marriage regulations more lenient, both in the state or in the church. But it's not because God has decided his original stand was wrong. We are adjusting ourselves and our requirements to the hardness of people's hearts. And the person who wants to fully serve God and please God will not need this allowance for the hardness of the human heart. I do not want to discourage anyone who has been caught in this type of problem. We have compassion for people in problems. And those of us who have been able to preserve our marriages should thank God that we had partners who would put up with us and with whom we were able to put up, and that ours did not follow the path of others, but not because we were more righteous, just more fortunate. And we do need to make adjustment to those who have problems, and we put nobody out of the church of the living God because they have problems. All sins can be forgiven. But friends, it does not mean it was the perfect will of God. It means it's a accommodative will of God, as Jesus taught here. He does give us a ground of divorce here, as far as God's concerned, with unchastity. Now, I do not want to make our broadcast here, our telecast, a denominational matter. But the Assemblies of God, of which I'm a member, has wrestled with this problem for a long time. And it was serious enough that we really were too harsh. For some time we had a rule, which was the will of God, but we had no small print at the bottom to take care of exceptional cases and problem cases. And several years ago at Miami, we adopted a number of policies which were more reasonable in this regard, and was pointed out in the statement made at that time that being married is the normal state of the individual. And while there are those who may be able to live in single happiness, that this is not the majority of individuals. And we made allowance at this time that if a person were guilty of repeated, hardened, inveterate unfaithfulness to their partner, that divorce and remarriage would be permitted. And we were very careful to state that this does not mean that every time that adultery occurs, that God expects you to run out and get a divorce. I've been an Army chaplain. It was some time ago, but at that time, our figures that we used on morality of the American soldier was that 15% of the men were incorrigible in sexual matters, and 75% of the men at some time or another were guilty either of fornication or adultery. Now this means that the majority of the general public cannot possibly get into the kingdom of God on the basis that they've been clear in this regard. It's because they're forgiven by the grace of God. And we'll not belabor this point. We're just saying, thank God there is mercy. But when we're talking about the perfect will of God, that's another thing. It's not the perfect will of God to need forgiveness, which we all need. We should actually need it on fewer subjects, if possible. Now, this strict rule of Christ was not received with great joy by the disciples. And Brother Beale will read to us from verse 10 through that little section there, verse 12.
The disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is not expedient to marry. But he said to them, Not all men can receive this precept, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. He who is able to receive this, let him receive it.
Now this word will need a little bit of explanation. It's not one that's commonly used. The word eunuch ordinarily and originally meant that the person had been emasculated. An operation had been performed which made it impossible for him to ever have any children. At the beginning, these men were used to carry out duties in Oriental palaces, tents, so on, of monarchs and princes. In the women's quarters, since they were incapable of relationships with the women, they were permitted to be in the women's quarter and be their servant. However, because of these duties, before long, the name eunuch got to be given to the people who did this kind of work. Some of them became household managers and so on. So not everywhere in the Bible does it actually, by eunuch, mean a person who has had this operation. But you'll find that Jesus here, in talking about it in relationship to marriage, classifies three types of people who live without sexual relationships. He said there's some people, verse 12 here, there's some people who by very nature are not going to be able to have normal sexual relationships. They are eunuchs from birth. Then there is a second class of eunuch who is the one who has provided the normal meaning of the word, and that is the person who's been made such by a surgical operation. And then he speaks of a third group here, which, as far as I'm concerned, involves no physical operation whatsoever. And that is the person who, to set himself aside for the service of God, deliberately refrains from the responsibilities of a wife and children and family, that he may serve without distraction in the service of God. It's a deliberate choice, a deliberate choice. I know of men who have postponed marriage and, so to speak, had been eunuchs for a period of 10 or 15 or 20 years, and some of them finally were married. I know one that I will not name, a very prominent person who was married for the first time after he was 60 years of age. Been a eunuch that long, and finally he married. I had a suspicion that it was her idea and not his. If he'd got along without marriage for 60 years, it just might have been the idea didn't occur to him, but occurred to the other person. There are other people who, like some of the medieval witnesses to the gospel in Europe, went at it the other way around. These particular believers, they were real Bible believers. They were married, had their children, and about the time the children were old enough to support themselves, would not be a burden on the mother, these men became preachers of the gospel and traveled all over Europe. And in fact, they're associated with the poor men of Lyon, they're sometimes called. And these men memorized the back trails, the hedge trails, the mountain trails, all over Europe. And some of these trails were used in World War II by the resistance. And these men knew how to get past the borders, knew how to get past the guards. And they preached the gospel. But in the process, they divorced their wives, maybe at the age of 35, 40 years of age, when their families were now 10, 12, 15 years of age. And the wife was left at home. Her husband never expected to come back to her again and go out and preach the gospel the rest of their lives. There are men who, by birth, will not have sexual relations. There are men who have had operations. But there are men who set themselves apart for the kingdom of God. And then Jesus said, don't try to be one of these if you belong to the other.